Before kings ruled empires, before cities rose from the dust, before mankind learned to write or build or conquer, there was still crime. The very first drop of blood that ever stained the earth came not from war or revenge, but from something much deeper: envy, pain, rejection. This is not just the story of two brothers. It is the story of the first betrayal, the first murder, and the first time a human heart darkened under the weight of choice. Welcome to Crime Documentary, and tonight, we unravel the first crime after the creation of the world. The wind was still young then, whispering through wild untouched fields, as the stars watched silently over the innocence of the earth, and the breath of creation still hung in the sky like a soft forgotten echo. The soil was fresh and rich and unmarked by blood or sorrow, and the sun had never yet seen the face of death. Everything was new, everything was alive, everything was glowing with the sacred pulse of beginnings. And within this untouched world, two brothers were born. One was Cain, the firstborn, the man of the earth whose hands learned to speak through soil and seed and sweat. The other was Abel, younger, softer, a keeper of sheep, whose days passed in gentle steps among the bleating and the breeze. They were sons of the first man and the first woman, and their lives stood at the edge of eternity, before the histories of kings or nations or violence had ever begun to write themselves across the face of time. Cain was strong and silent and proud, his eyes always scanning the horizon as if waiting for something more. He tilled the ground with hands that cracked under the sun and grew food from the earth itself. He learned the language of dirt and roots and sweat. His muscles grew like the trees he planted, wide and steady and unyielding. He worked long hours, and his hands were rarely clean, and when he slept, it was the sleep of someone who had earned his rest with every heartbeat. He believed in fairness, he believed in order, and he believed that if he gave, he should receive. He was not cruel, but he was not soft, and he measured everything by the weight of what he had to sacrifice to get it. His world was shaped by labor, by effort, by what could be seen and touched and held. Abel, on the other hand, moved like the breeze. Itself his steps were light, and his voice was calm, and he often smiled for no reason other than the joy of being alive. He cared for sheep and spoke to them as if they were his children, and the animals responded with affection and trust. He watched the skies with wonder, and he felt peace in places where others felt silence. He gave names to stars, he followed the shape of clouds, and he thanked the Creator, not just with words, but with gratitude that lived deep within his soul. Abel did not chase after greatness, he simply walked with it unknowingly in every breath. He was not stronger than Cain, and he did not work harder, but there was something about him that made everything around him feel lighter, warmer, gentler. One day the Creator asked both brothers to offer something in worship. It was not a command but a calling, a chance to give back from what they had received. Cain gathered fruits and vegetables from his harvest. He selected what seemed right, what seemed decent, what represented the work of his hands. It was the product of his labor, and he laid it on the altar with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his offering was worthy. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, the best, the purest, the most unblemished of his lambs. He carried it in his arms as if cradling a treasure, and his eyes did not look around for praise. He looked only upward with silent hope. Fire came from the heavens and consumed Abel's offering, but Cain's remained untouched. The sky had chosen, and it had not chosen him. At that moment, something inside Cain shifted. It was not just pain. It was not just confusion. It was something deeper, something older, something that had perhaps been waiting for a doorway into the human soul. It stepped through him like shadow into light. He looked at his brother, not with the eyes of a man but with the heart of a storm. He did not understand why his offering was rejected. He had worked so hard, he had earned every grain, he had spilled sweat into every root. Was it not enough? Why did the Creator favor Abel? Was love only for the gentle? Did peace matter more than effort? The question circled his mind like wolves circling prey. and the more he asked, the more bitter the answers became. Cain tried to hide it. He smiled at Abel when he spoke. He joined him at meals. He continued working his fields as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. His thoughts were not his own anymore. At night he stared at the stars, and instead of wonder he felt mockery. The same stars that once danced now seemed to blink with secrets he was not allowed to know. The silence between him and Abel grew like a wall, thick and cold and invisible. Abel sensed none of this. He continued treating Cain as his brother, as his family, as his companion in a world still too young to understand cruelty. He did not see the fire growing behind Cain's eyes. He did not hear the pounding in his brother's chest that grew louder. With every passing day, Cain began to speak less. He watched more. He listened not to words, but to the movements of Abel, the way he cared, the way he prayed, the way the Creator seemed to smile on him. Every moment became a comparison. Every comparison became a wound, and every wound fed the thing growing inside him. He began to think of silence not just as absence, but as a tool, a way to end the noise of rejection, a way to stop feeling like he was second, a way to erase the difference between being chosen and being forgotten. He imagined what it would be like if Abel were not there, if the field belonged to him alone, if the Creator had no one else to favor, if the silence was complete and final and deep enough to bury even his own doubt. He spoke one morning in a voice too calm to be real. "Let us go to the field, brother, just the two of us." Abel agreed without question. There was no reason to fear. He trusted Cain with the innocence of someone who had never been betrayed. They walked side by side, their shadows long across the earth, and the sheep trailing behind like a small army of peace. Cain said little. Abel filled the air with thoughts about the new lamb born just days ago, and how he had seen a strange shape in the sky that looked like a bird with 4 wings. Cain nodded, but his mind was not with the lamb or the sky. It was with the stone in the grass. It was with the silence that would follow. The earth was quiet that morning, too quiet, and the trees stood still, and the birds did not sing, as if the entire world knew something was coming, something that would break it forever. Cain's fingers curled and uncurled. His breath was slow and heavy. Abel walked ahead, unaware, unafraid, unchanged. The sun shone down like it always did, but its warmth did not reach Cain. He felt cold inside. The kind of cold that comes not from winter, but from the death of something sacred. He looked at his brother and saw not a person but a mirror that reflected everything he would never be, and he could not bear it anymore. He reached down slowly, pretending to pick something from the ground, and his hand closed around the stone, and the wind paused, and the world held its breath, and the stars closed their eyes. Cain's heart was no longer his own, and he could feel it thudding inside him like the beat of something ancient, something wild, something without mercy. His eyes no longer saw his brother the way they used to. Where once there had been familiarity and blood and belonging, now there was only a shape that stirred pain, a presence that ignited every forgotten moment of being passed over and left behind. He walked through the fields beside Abel, and yet his thoughts were miles away, buried under questions and silence and something darker than either of them had words for. He wondered if Abel could hear the pounding of his soul, if he could sense that something was wrong, if he could feel the shift in the air that now seemed thicker, heavier, harder to breathe. But Abel remained light in his step and calm in his spirit, and he spoke with the same gentleness as he always had. His voice was like water running across smooth stones, and he told Cain stories of the flock and the way a mother sheep had stayed awake all night to warm her newborns, and how he thought perhaps the Creator smiled even at the animals. He laughed once when a small insect landed on his sleeve, and he let it crawl across his arm before setting it on a leaf. To Abel, everything was part of something divine, and everything deserved kindness, and everything had meaning. Cain listened, but not truly. The words fell around him like leaves that no longer mattered. He felt no beauty, no peace, no warmth. Only the sound of something cracking within him, one slow second at a time. He began to study the way Abel walked, the way his hands moved, the way he crouched to touch the grass, and how the sheep followed without fear. It was like watching a flame burn in slow motion, and wanting more than anything to extinguish it. Cain's thoughts circled like vultures above a dying creature, and the more he watched, the more unbearable it became. There was no relief, no comfort, not even in the work he once loved. The soil that used to bring him peace now mocked him with its silence. The plants grew because he forced them to grow, but they gave him no pride. The sweat on his back no longer tasted of reward. It was bitterness now. A bitterness that Abel seemed immune to. And that made it worse. Much worse. At night, Cain would stare at the stars, but they no longer whispered secrets. They stared back cold and distant like judges that refused to answer. He remembered how Abel once named one of the brighter stars, and spoke of it like a friend, and Cain hated that memory now. He wanted to forget that Abel had ever smiled, that Abel had ever breathed, that Abel had ever existed. He began to avoid him in the daylight, finding reasons to stay away, to work alone, to listen only to the sound of his own footsteps. But even that was not enough, because Abel's presence was everywhere. In the sheep that wandered too close to his land, in the way his parents looked at them both, in the very air that still carried the scent of smoke from the accepted offering. Cain tried to fight it. He tried to pretend it did not matter. He told himself that he could move on, that he could be better, that he could earn that same approval. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fire that had consumed Abel's lamb and not his harvest. He saw the brightness that came from above and refused to touch what he had made. And in those moments he knew that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he gave, something in him would always fall short. And he hated that. He hated what it did to his soul. He hated what it made him feel. And most of all, he hated that Abel never seemed to feel it at all. The thoughts did not come all at once. They arrived in pieces like shadows creeping into a room before the sun has fully set. First it was the idea that things would be simpler if Abel was not around. Then it was the fantasy of what it might feel like to have silence at last. Then it was the curiosity of what would happen if he simply pushed the world a little. If he tested the edges of what was possible. If he broke the silence with something final, something unchangeable, and then finally it became a plan. A thought. So clear, so quiet, so cold, that it no longer felt like a question. It felt like truth. He began to watch the stones more closely, to count the trees, to measure the distance between where Abel grazed his sheep and where no one else would hear. He learned the patterns of Abel's steps, when he rose, when he rested, when he spoke with their father, when he sang alone in the field. Cain knew all of it. He memorized it like scripture. Not because he loved his brother, but because he was preparing to erase him. Every moment they shared now felt like an opportunity, waiting to be used, and Cain waited. He waited because he wanted the moment to be perfect, because he wanted the silence to be complete, because he wanted the earth itself to know what he had become. And then the day came. The sun rose slowly that morning, and the sky was painted with the soft colors of peace. Abel was already awake, tending to the lambs, one of which had gone missing. In the night, he hummed softly as he searched, calling gently to the little creature, as if his voice alone could lead it home. Cain approached without sound, without emotion, without the weight of hesitation. His voice was smooth when he spoke. "Come, let us walk, brother. Let us go into the field together. It has been too long since we spoke." Abel looked up and smiled the way he always did. A smile that was not earned, but given freely, without thought, without fear, without doubt. They walked side by side through the grass, and the morning dew clung to their feet. The sheep followed at a distance, and the birds began to sing again, as if unaware of what was coming. Abel talked of small things, of how the season had been kind, and how he hoped one day to build a shelter for the weakest of the lambs, and how he had seen a strange tree near the water that he had never noticed before. His voice was soft and calm, and filled with the kind of innocence that does not imagine evil can exist in the same breath. Cain nodded and answered, but only with sounds, not with meaning. His mind was locked in a place far from words, far from mercy, far from brotherhood. The field stretched wide before them, like an empty page waiting to be written in blood. Cain's heart beat slowly now, with clarity, with resolve, with something colder than hatred. He let Abel walk a few steps ahead, watching. The way the sun caught in his hair, the way his hands brushed against the tall grass, the way he knelt to examine the soil. And then Cain looked at this stone. It lay in the grass like it had always been there, waiting not by chance but by fate. He bent down and picked it up slowly, as if testing its weight, as if confirming what he already knew. This was the moment. This was the breath before history shattered. This was the end of peace, and still Abel did not know. He looked back at Cain and smiled and said something about how beautiful the day was. And Cain did not answer, because there was nothing left to say, only the sound of silence and the stone. The field stretched out in every direction under the vast open sky, and time seemed to slow as the two brothers stood alone in that sacred silence where the breath of creation still lingered. But something darker had come to visit that morning. Something not born of stars or soil, but of thought, of fire, of rejection. Cain stood behind Abel, now watching his younger brother crouch near the ground, his hand extended toward a single fragile flower that had grown wild among the tall grass. A flower that had no knowledge of hate or judgment, or what was about to unfold beside it. The wind moved gently through the field, brushing against their skin like the fingers of something ancient and unseen, and the birds, high above, circled, but made no sound, as if they too were waiting for the moment when peace would fall and never rise again. Cain felt the stone in his hand, and it felt alive, it felt warm. It felt like the final answer to a question that had never left his heart since the fire consumed Abel's offering, but not his own. He looked at Abel and saw not his brother, not the boy he had grown up beside, not the child who had shared food and stories and laughter, not the son of their parents, not the shepherd who sang to his flock, not the one who had once cried when a lamb broke its leg and stayed up all night to comfort it. Cain saw only the reason for his rejection, the reflection of all his failure, the symbol of everything he had lost without understanding why. His hand tightened around the stone, and his breathing grew deeper, slower, colder. Abel spoke again, turning his head slightly, his voice light and trusting, and filled with the kind of peace only known to those who have never seen betrayal. He asked Cain if he had seen the lamb that had wandered too far, the one with the black spot near its eye, the one he had named after the sky. Cain did not answer. He could not. His mouth had forgotten how to form words, and his soul was no longer asking for reasons, it was demanding resolution. In his mind, there was no going back. There was no tomorrow where this moment could be undone. There was only now, only this breath, only this weight in his hand, only this scream inside him that could only be silenced by the absence of the one who had been chosen over him. Cain lifted the stone slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the air itself, as if the wind might stop him, as if the world might shift in some unseen way to stop what he was about to do. But nothing moved. The birds stayed silent. The trees held their breath. The sky above remained calm. Abel turned fully, now standing upright, brushing the dirt from his knees, and looking at his brother with eyes that knew no fear, no suspicion, no reason to run. He smiled again, that gentle smile that had once brought comfort to others, and now only brought pain to Cain. And in that smile Cain saw the fire again, saw the offering accepted, saw the Creator's favor, saw the space between them that would never be crossed. The stone came down. It struck flesh and bone, and time itself seemed to shatter. There was no sound at first, only the vibration of impact, only the movement of a body collapsing into grass, only the echo of something breaking inside Cain that he could never put back together. Abel fell with a softness that made it worse. He did not cry out. He did not fight. He simply dropped like a petal falling from a dying flower. His eyes wide not with fear, but with confusion, as if trying to understand not what had happened, but why. Blood began to pool beneath his head, dark and thick and quiet, and the soil drank it like water after drought, and the earth was no longer pure. Cain stood over him, breathing heavily, the stone still in his hand, stained now with the first human blood ever spilled. He looked down and saw what he had done, but his heart did not scream, his eyes did not weep. There was only silence. A silence so deep, so infinite, that it swallowed the wind, the sky, the world. Abel's chest no longer moved. His hands, once filled with gentleness, now lay limp at his sides, and his face, once filled with life, now stared up at the clouds that drifted above, unaware of the crime they had just witnessed. The lambs in the distance began to call out, bleating softly, as if sensing something had gone horribly wrong. But they did not come closer. Cain dropped the stone. It fell beside the body with a dull thud and disappeared into the grass. He stared at his brother's face, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe relief, maybe meaning, but all he saw was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that does not heal. The kind that lives in silence forever. He stepped back once, then again, and looked around the field as if expecting someone to emerge, as if waiting for the Creator to descend in wrath, as if the earth itself would open and swallow him for what he had done. But nothing happened. No voice spoke, no fire fell, no hand reached down to stop him. The world simply continued spinning around this new wound. He knelt slowly beside the body, placing one hand on Abel's chest as if to confirm what he already knew. There was no breath. There was no rhythm. The body was warm but lifeless, and it felt wrong, so wrong, to touch his brother and feel nothing returning. Cain whispered his name once, then again, but the silence swallowed it each time. He stood again and looked at the sky, now filled with light, but that light no longer felt divine. It felt distant, cold, unreachable. He had done what he had imagined. He had silenced the voice that haunted him. He had erased the reflection that wounded him. And yet he did not feel whole. He felt less. So much less. He began to walk in circles, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to feel, unsure of who he was now. His hands shook not from fear, but from the absence of emotion. He looked at the blood on his fingers and tried to wipe it on the grass. But the color remained like a brand, like a truth etched into his skin. He crouched again beside Abel, and this time not to check for life, but to hide what was left. He pulled branches and leaves from nearby bushes, piling them over the body, as if that could undo the act, as if the world would forget, as if he could pretend it had never happened. But the ground beneath his feet had changed. The air around him had changed. The silence inside him had changed. Nothing could go back to what it was. He was no longer a man who worked the land. He was no longer a brother. He was no longer the firstborn. He was something else now. Something that the earth had never known. Something that the stars would never speak to. He had crossed a line that had never existed before, and now it stretched behind him, forever marking him with a story that could not be rewritten. He sat beside the pile of branches and waited for the sky to answer. Waited for the voice of the Creator. Waited for the wrath or the forgiveness or the judgment. But the sky remained silent. The wind returned, but it did not speak. The lambs wandered near, but stopped short as if afraid to approach. Cain looked at his hands again and saw not blood but memory. A memory that would follow him wherever he went. A memory that would become a shadow longer than any night. And for the first time since the stone fell, Cain felt something inside him collapse. Not with noise, not with fire, but with the slow, quiet crumble of a man who had killed not for hunger, not for defense, but because he could not bear to feel less than another. He had thought the silence would save him, but now he knew. The silence had only begun. Cain sat in the field for a long time, unmoving, unblinking, unable to understand the shape of what he had done. The grass no longer felt soft beneath him, and the sky above no longer offered warmth or wonder. Everything was numb and empty and wide, like an ocean with no shore. The pile of leaves and branches that covered his brother's body looked like nothing at all to anyone who did not know what lay beneath, but to Cain it was heavier than stone, darker than night, louder than any scream. He tried to close his eyes, but every time he did, he saw the moment again, the way the stone had fallen, the way the silence had followed, the way Abel's eyes had gone still. He had not cried then, and he could not cry now, but something inside him was bleeding in a way that no one could see. The wind picked up slowly as if the earth itself had awakened from a long, quiet sleep. Cain stood up and took a step back, his legs unsure, his breath shallow and dry. He looked at the field around him and realized how still it was, as if the world was waiting for him to say something, to confess something, to feel something real. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was only a noise inside him, a sound that did not know how to become language. He clenched his fists and turned away from the hidden body and walked without knowing where he was going. His feet moved across the land like shadows over water, but there was no direction, only distance. Wandered into the trees, and for a while he pretended that he could forget. He imagined that if he walked far enough, the memory would fade, that the blood would vanish, that the sky would forget to ask questions. But deep inside he knew nothing would be forgotten. He could not walk far enough. He could not become someone else. The voice would find him. The earth had seen too much. And then, the voice came not from wind, not from trees, not from within, but from the very center of all things. It came without volume, yet it filled every part of him. It asked a question so simple and so heavy that it brought Cain to his knees. "Where's your brother?" Cain stared at the dirt beneath his hands and tried not to answer, but the silence waited and pressed against his bones. He lifted his head and forced his lips to shape the lie, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The words tasted bitter and wrong, as if they were made of ash. The silence broke, and the voice returned, not louder but deeper, and it said, "What have you done?" The voice did not yell, it did not strike, it did not accuse. It simply knew. It spoke with sorrow, not with rage, with truth, not with thunder. It said, "Your brother's blood cries to me from the ground." Cain fell forward, pressing his face into the soil, as if he could disappear into it, as if the earth would open and swallow him out of mercy. But the ground did not want him. It had accepted Abel's blood, but it would not accept his regret. The voice continued, not with punishment, but with certainty. "You are now cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer upon the earth." Cain trembled, not with fear, but with the cold understanding that he no longer belonged. He had not only killed his brother. He had killed the place where he belonged. He had torn a hole in the world, and nothing could fill it again. He looked around and saw the trees that once gave him shade, the rivers that once quenched his thirst, the land that once gave him harvest. And now all of it turned away from him. He would walk this earth forever, not with chains, not with fire, but with memory. A sentence not spoken by men, but written in the silence of everything he had broken. He cried out then, not with tears, but with a voice that cracked the sky. "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You have driven me out this day from the face of the ground, and from your presence I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer upon the earth, and it shall be that whoever finds me shall kill me." But the voice answered, not with wrath, but with a mark, a sign not to punish, but to protect. The voice said, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the mark was placed upon him, not on his skin, but on his soul, a mark that all would see and none would understand. A mark that said this one has killed, and yet this one must live. Cain rose to his feet, slowly, his body heavy with the weight of judgment, but heavier still with the weight of what could not be undone. He looked back at the field where the leaves still lay undisturbed, and the wind moved around them like mourning. He did not dare return. He did not dare look again upon the place where he had ended his brother's life. Instead he turned and walked away. The ground was no longer soil. It was memory. And memory does not yield to footsteps. He walked for days, for weeks, for what felt like eternity, through forests and over mountains, across rivers and through valleys, but no matter where he went, he was alone. People came later, cities were built. Children were born, names were given, and songs were sung, but Cain never stayed. He moved from place to place, never planting, never resting, never staying. He watched as the world grew, as others built lives and shared meals and raised flocks and told stories around firelight. He listened from the shadows and sometimes wept, though he did not know why. He was part of the first family, and yet he was now apart from all families. He had created the first silence between brothers, and now no voice could reach him. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, sweating, breathless, heart pounding, with visions of Abel's eyes staring at him, eyes not filled with anger, not filled with blame, but filled with the kind of sadness that never stops asking why. He would run from those dreams, but they followed him. He would speak to the stars, hoping one would answer, but they remained silent. He would place his hand upon the earth and feel nothing. No warmth, no forgiveness, no connection. The ground remembered, and the ground would not forget. He aged as all men do. His hair grayed, his back bent, his steps slowed. And still he wandered. Some called him a legend, others called him a ghost. But he was neither. He was simply a man who had broken something no one could repair. A man who had been given everything and still lost himself. A man who had held love in one hand and a stone in the other, and chose the stone in his final days. He sat beside a river that did not know his name and watched the water pass without end. He spoke to the sky once more and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The voice had spoken, and the silence had answered. He closed his eyes and saw not fire and not death. He saw two brothers walking in a field before anything had gone wrong, before the offering, before the stone, before the silence. He saw a smile, he saw trust, he saw peace, and then he saw the first crime fade into the wind, and the earth kept turning, and the stars kept watching, and the silence remained.